I remember the air at 2 in the morning more clearly than any sunrise in my life, cold, thin, and sharp enough to make my lungs burn. Fort Liberty was silent except for the low hum of the floodlights and the distant rumble of a truck engine on the perimeter road. My boots crunched against the damp gravel as I moved through the last stretch of the night exercise. It was supposed to be just another training drill. No one should have been aiming at anyone. No one should have had live rounds. That was the rule. That was the system I trusted. But trust is exactly how they catch you off guard. My chest tightened with that strange feeling soldiers sometimes get right before something bad happens. I had felt it in combat zones overseas. It had a weight. It slid down your spine like cold water. At that hour, the air on base never felt still. But that night, it did. Too still. I adjusted the strap on my vest and scanned the tree line. My team was moving in pairs behind me. Radio chatter was quiet, too quiet for an active drill. My brother Ethan was somewhere near the command vehicle watching. They had said he was just observing. But nothing about Ethan was ever just anything. A light flicked from a tower to the left. My pulse picked up. I crouched lower, breathing through my teeth. The night smelled like wet grass diesel fuel, and that faint metal tang every soldier knows. It was the kind of scent that crawls under your skin. I took one more step. That was the moment I saw it. A red dot bloomed on my chest. It was so small, so clean, a perfect circle of light right over my heart. I froze. In training exercises, the laser is usually green. Red means live. My hand twitched toward my radio. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then, the world cracked open. The gunshot wasn't loud. It was flat, a short, brutal sound that cut through everything else. It punched into me before I even heard the echo. My body jolted back and the world tilted sideways. I hit the ground hard. The gravel bit into my palms. The night sky spun above me, blurred with the beam of the floodlights. It was as if time thickened. Every heartbeat was a hammer inside my skull. Someone yelled, "Training accident!" Another voice shouted for a medic. Boots slammed against the ground. Shouts blended with the static of the radios. But what cut deepest wasn't the noise. It was the silence in Ethan's voice. He didn't shout my name. He didn't run to me. He stood there controlling the scene. My fingers clawed at the dirt, trying to hold on to something solid, but the cold crept in faster than thought. Warmth spread beneath my shoulder where the bullet tore through. I stared at the sky. I'd seen night skies in Afghanistan, Iraq, and over the Pacific. But none looked like this. The light above Fort Liberty flickered like a pulse. My pulse. My ears filled with a high ringing, drowning out everything else. I could still hear Ethan calm and clear telling someone to secure the perimeter. He sounded like a man handling a problem, not a sister bleeding on the ground. My breath came shallow like air through a straw. The edges of my vision folded in. My heartbeat slowed. It's strange what the mind does at the edge of consciousness. It remembers everything. I thought of the sound of our father's boots on the porch when we were kids. I thought of how Ethan always got to sit in the front seat while I waited in the back. I thought of the way he had smiled at me just before the drill started. Not warm, not brotherly, just cold. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Hands pressed against my chest. Someone shouted to stay with them. The sky fractured into flashing red and white. Then there was nothing. Just silence. Cold. A weight lifted and everything slowed to a whisper inside my skull. People say your life flashes before your eyes. Mine didn't. What flashed was the truth I should have seen long ago. Family can be the hand that steadies you, or the finger that pulls the trigger. If you've ever survived a moment when someone decided you shouldn't exist anymore, listen closely. This is the story of what happened after I stopped breathing. This is how everything began. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than any shouting. Our father believed discipline was measured in how quiet the walls could become after his boots hit the floor. We lived just outside Fayetteville, close enough to hear helicopters from the base on warm nights. The house smelled of gun oil starch and the kind of fear that never needed to be spoken aloud. I learned early to move carefully to lower my voice to keep my shoulders squared even at the dinner table. Our father liked order. He liked Ethan more. Ethan was the golden son. He was taller, louder, quick, with the kind of smile our father approved of. When he stood in front of a mirror in his junior ROTC uniform, our father's eyes softened. When I tried to do the same, he adjusted my collar without looking at me. The difference between us wasn't just gender. It was loyalty. He belonged to our father's vision. I was an inconvenience to it. I remember one summer evening when Ethan and I were 12 and 10. We were tossing a ball in the backyard while cicadas screamed in the trees. I missed the catch. The ball hit the fence and rolled into the neighbor's yard. Our father's voice came from the doorway, even and cold. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Ethan ran to retrieve the ball. I hesitated. By the time I came back, my father had already decided who was weak. From then on, I understood something about him. He didn't see weakness as something to fix. He saw it as something to crush. At night, the house always fell into a kind of military silence. Dinner at 1800. Chores timed down to the second. Television off by 2100. Any sound after lights out felt like an act of rebellion. Ethan thrived under that system. I learned to survive it. Our father taught Ethan how to polish boots and fold uniforms. He taught me how to keep the house clean and stay out of the way. When I tried to join Ethan's early morning runs, my father told me I was distracting him, that I should know my place. Those words grew like weeds in my head. Know your place. That phrase shaped every choice I made for years. It wasn't just that Ethan was loved more. It was that he learned how to use that love like a weapon. By high school, he was already mimicking our father's tone, the clipped commands, the steady stare that said no one could challenge him. When teachers praised me, Ethan made sure my father heard about the one thing I did wrong. He never needed to raise a hand. He only had to smile the way our father smiled. That was enough. There was a night I still remember more clearly than most. A storm rolled over Fayetteville. The power went out. I was 13. The house was quiet except for the wind. I crept downstairs to get a flashlight. Ethan was sitting at the table with our father. Their faces were lit by the dull orange of a candle. They didn't see me at first. I heard my father say he was proud of Ethan, that he was everything a Vaughn should be. I waited for my name. It never came. Something small cracked inside me that night. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just went back upstairs and packed a duffel bag with nothing but an old sweatshirt and a flashlight. I didn't run away. I just needed to know I could. That moment became a quiet promise to myself. One day, I would not live in a house where my existence felt like a problem to be managed. By the time I turned 17, Ethan was already wearing the uniform our father loved. He came home from his training weekends with stories and medals. Our father beamed. I came home from part-time jobs tired and visible. He would look through me as if I were air. Our mother wasn't in the picture. She left when I was 9. My father told everyone she was weak. I grew up wondering if she had just decided she couldn't breathe in that house any longer. I understood her better with every passing year. Ethan learned how to control narratives from him. He told the neighbors I was distant, too soft, too emotional. They believed him because he was charming and I was quiet. In small towns, silence is never trusted. The summer after graduation, Ethan was accepted into a military program. The entire neighborhood came to our house for a barbecue. Flags on the fence, music from the porch. Our father held Ethan's hand up like a champion's. My name was barely spoken. People congratulated him. They didn't see me standing 2 feet away. I remember holding a paper plate with cold coleslaw and staring at the back of Ethan's head, wondering if he would even notice if I disappeared. The truth is, he wouldn't. Because in our family, Ethan was the story. I was the footnote. The night before he left, he knocked on my door. He wasn't cruel that night. He wasn't kind either. He leaned against the frame, told me I'd better learn to follow or be forgotten. He didn't say it with malice. He said it like it was a fact carved into stone. I didn't reply. I just watched him walk away. That was the first time I realized my brother didn't see me as a sister. He saw me as an obstacle. When I enlisted 2 years later, it wasn't because I wanted to follow him. It was because I wanted to leave Fayetteville behind. I wanted to build a life where my worth didn't depend on the weight of his shadow. But the past has a way of following you in uniform. It hides in the salute. It hides in the structure, it hides in every word that tells you where you belong. The military gave me a new name, a new rank, a new identity. But every time Ethan called me little sister, I felt 10 years old again. The old house wasn't just a building. It was a blueprint of how control works when it's dressed up as tradition. I carried that blueprint with me into every deployment, every base, every quiet night when someone's footsteps echoed too close. I told myself it was behind me. I told myself Ethan was just a ghost of childhood. I was wrong. The silence that raised me would return not as memory, but as the sound of a gunshot under the floodlights. And long before it happened, the cracks were already there. They had been there since the first time my father adjusted my collar without looking me in the eye. Coming back to Fort Liberty after 12 years overseas felt less like a homecoming and more like walking into a room where the air remembered everything you tried to forget. The gates looked the same. The rows of pine trees leaning against the Carolina sky hadn't changed. The perimeter road still smelled like diesel and damp clay. But something inside me stiffened the moment the guard checked my ID and waved me through. My chest felt tight in the way it used to when I was a teenager driving past the base with Ethan and our father, both of them talking about honor and legacy like it was the family's only language. This time, I was wearing the uniform. This time, the legacy wasn't a distant shadow. It was standing right in front of me. Ethan had already been here for a year. He had rank now. Not just rank he earned. Rank that came wrapped in handshakes, family friends, and the kind of invisible weight that can tilt entire rooms. The first time I saw him after I returned, he was walking down the hallway outside the operations center like he owned the place. Technically, he didn't. But power isn't just about rank. It's about how people behave when you enter a room. When Ethan entered, they straightened up before he even said a word. He hugged me like he was welcoming me back. It was the kind of hug you give someone while measuring their weaknesses. He asked about my deployments, smiled in that smooth way that makes everyone else believe he's just a proud brother. But I knew that smile. It meant he'd already planned how to put me in a box that he could control. My first weeks at Fort Liberty were a blur of briefings, training schedules, and settling into the barracks. But there were patterns. My name disappeared from certain rosters without explanation. I was scheduled for tasks that didn't match my rank or years of service. Rumors started before I ever opened my mouth. Ethan's friends said I was still recovering from my last deployment. Others said I needed time to adjust. None of it was true. It didn't have to be. Ethan didn't have to push me down directly. He just had to plant the right seeds in the right ears. It was the same strategy he used when we were kids. He'd smile while the ground under my feet quietly shifted. I signed up for an advanced leadership course scheduled for the end of the quarter. It was the kind of program that opened doors, the kind that changed the shape of your future in the service. A week later, my application was flagged as ineligible. No reason listed. Just a clean denial. When I went to the office to ask why the clerk avoided my eyes, I didn't need an explanation. I already knew whose hand was behind it. Ethan wanted me contained. He had learned how to control narratives long ago. Now he had rank to do it with a smile and a signature. The part that stung most wasn't the denial itself. It was how quietly it happened. No confrontation, no visible enemy, just a wall closing in around me without sound. At night, in my small on-base quarters, I could hear the same hum of helicopters I used to hear as a child. I thought I had buried that sound under sand and sea during those years overseas. But sounds have long memories. It followed me through the vents, through the glass, through the dark. I told myself it was just an adjustment period, that I could carve out my own space. But when I saw Ethan sitting at the table in the officer's lounge, surrounded by people laughing at his stories, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. It was that quiet shrinking I thought I had outgrown. The invisible chain pulling me back into the shape he had made for me long ago. He started dropping into my unit's briefings, offering helpful suggestions, acting like a concerned brother. It looked harmless to everyone else. But I could see the pattern building piece by piece. Control never starts with a punch. It starts with a hand on your shoulder that doesn't let go. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window outside the training grounds. I looked like someone I didn't want to be. My uniform was sharp, my face calm, But behind my eyes was that same teenager from Fayetteville trying to breathe inside a house built to contain her. I clenched my jaw and told myself I wasn't that girl anymore. But Ethan was patient. He always had been. It wasn't about forcing me down. It was about making the cage feel familiar again. I'd seen cages like this overseas built out of politics power and quiet manipulation. But this one was worse, because this one had my last name on it. Weeks turned into months. I pushed harder in training, trying to earn my way through the walls closing in. But every time I moved forward, something shifted behind the scenes to push me 2 steps back. By the time fall rolled in, the leaves near the airfield were burning orange. It should have felt like a new season. Instead, it felt like the past had found me and put its hands back around my throat softly, like it had all the time in the world. That was when I realized the truth. Fort Liberty wasn't just a duty station. It was the house I grew up in wearing a different uniform. And Ethan was still standing in the doorway smiling like he owned every inch of it. The first sign that something was wrong came wrapped in the kind of detail most people wouldn't notice. The training schedule for the following week had been posted on the bulletin board outside the operations room like it always was. Neat lines, black ink, standard layout. But one line didn't belong. Night Ops. 0200 hours. Bravo Company adjusted location. It wasn't a big red flag. It was just strange. Night ops at that hour were usually scheduled weeks in advance, not dropped in quietly on a Thursday afternoon. My name was on the roster. I read it twice. Then I noticed another name scribbled into the margin. Ethan Vaughn, Observer. The word sat there like a splinter under the skin. Ethan had never once attended our company's night drills. It wasn't part of his command structure. There was no operational reason for him to be anywhere near that training. He didn't belong there. But people like Ethan don't need to belong. They just show up and everyone else adjusts. I stood there longer than I meant to, the fluorescent lights humming above me, the hallway almost empty. For most soldiers, it was just another late-night drill. For me, it was the sound of something starting to move beneath the surface. Over the next few days, the little things added up. Conversations went quiet when I walked into rooms. Schedules were shifted with no clear explanations. The rangemaster avoided my eyes. It felt like walking on ground that looked solid but had begun to give under my boots. One evening, just before sunset, I was walking past the admin wing when I heard Ethan's voice. Not loud, not careless, but low and measured the way he always spoke when he wanted control over something. I slowed my steps. The door to one of the briefing rooms was cracked open. I didn't mean to stop. I just did. Inside, Ethan was speaking to Sergeant Cole, one of the men who had served under our father years ago. I hadn't heard that voice in over a decade, but I recognized it instantly. Cole had been part of the old guard, the men who thought the Vaughn name carried weight like a badge. Ethan said something I couldn't catch. Cole laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't belong in a military briefing. Then Ethan said, clear enough for me to hear through the gap in the door, "It needs to look clean. No questions." My stomach tightened. Cole asked something. Ethan answered, "You know how these things go. Training accidents happen all the time. Training accidents." The phrase hit like a hand closing around the back of my neck. There are words in the military that mean more than they say. Those 2 words were among them. I'd heard them in debriefings and stories soldiers tell in quiet bars when no one else is listening. Training accident can mean 1,000 things, but when spoken by someone like Ethan, it never means what it's supposed to. My fingers dug into the strap of my bag. I wanted to push the door open to ask him what the hell he was planning, but I didn't. Ethan didn't make mistakes when people were watching. If he was saying this here, it was because he was sure no one would stop him. I backed away, careful not to let my boots echo down the hallway. That night, I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling. The base was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Every sound of the air vents, every step in the corridor outside felt too sharp. I thought about the way Ethan's voice wrapped itself around those 2 words. I thought about Sergeant Cole loyal to our father long after he should have retired. And I thought about my name on that roster. At 0200, under the cover of an ordinary night drill, Something was being set in motion. I didn't know the shape of it yet, but I felt it in my bones the way you feel a storm long before you see lightning. The next day, I went to the quartermaster under the excuse of checking equipment for the drill. I signed out a light plate carrier, the kind that fits under a standard uniform, without drawing attention. It wasn't regulation for this kind of training, but it wasn't forbidden either. People don't question a soldier who prepares. I checked the seams twice, then folded it under my jacket before heading back to the barracks. When night came, I sat in the dark with the radio in my hands. It was an old model, not the standard issue. It had a built-in recorder, something most people didn't bother using anymore. I had kept it from my last overseas rotation tucked away with my personal gear. That night, I slid fresh batteries into it and tested the red light until it blinked steady. If something was going to happen, I needed proof. Ethan was untouchable in too many ways, but even people like him bleed when the system sees them clearly. I couldn't trust anyone else. If I went to my CO with a hunch, he'd wave it away. If I confronted Ethan, he'd smile and make it sound like paranoia. So I said nothing. I strapped the recorder to the inside of my vest, where no one would look. As I moved through the quiet hallways, the base felt like it was holding its breath. It wasn't fear that ran through me. It was that cold clarity that comes before a shot is fired. I had felt it overseas when a convoy slowed down just a little too much on a dusty road. That same current slid under my skin now. Fort Liberty was my duty station, but in that moment, it felt like enemy territory. The next morning, Ethan found me outside the mess hall. He walked up with that easy confidence, holding a coffee like nothing in the world had weight. He asked how I was feeling about the drill. There was a glint in his eyes, just a flicker, like he knew something I didn't. I answered him with a steady smile, the one I used in combat zones when I needed someone to underestimate me. He patted my shoulder like an older brother. To anyone else, it probably looked like affection. To me, it felt like a hand closing a door. As he walked away, I heard the same thing in his footsteps that I used to hear in our father's boots. It wasn't sound. It was control. Later that evening, I sat alone in the armory, double-checking every piece of my gear. No one else was around. The low hum of the ventilation filled the room. My hands moved over the straps of the vest, the radio, the weight of the rifle. Everything was exactly where it needed to be, and yet nothing about it felt right. It felt staged, like a theater set waiting for the actors to arrive. And in the center of it all was Ethan. He had chosen the time. He had chosen the place. He had even chosen the story they would tell when it was over. But he had not chosen how it would end. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew this much. I wasn't the same girl who had stood in our father's house in silence. This time, if Ethan pulled a trigger, I would make sure the world heard it. The quiet before danger isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a schedule on a wall and a smile you know too well. The night of the drill felt heavier than any deployment night I had ever known. Fort Liberty was wrapped in darkness, except for the floodlights that carved thin silver lines across the training field. The air carried the smell of wet grass and cold steel. The ground under my boots was damp from a light rain that had passed through hours earlier. It was 2 a.m., a time that didn't belong to ordinary soldiers, a time that belonged to silence. My squad moved into position on the perimeter, each of us dressed for what was supposed to be a standard night exercise. No one spoke. Radios clicked softly. Breathing fogged in the cold air. The trees on the east side of the field looked like tall black walls, swallowing the light and leaving patches of shadow deep enough to disappear in. I wore the light vest under my uniform, the plate cold against my skin. The recorder inside was running. The tiny red light blinked steadily against my ribs. The rangemaster barked instructions. Movement began. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth as we advanced toward the mock objective. The scenario was routine, nothing that should have required live ammunition. At least that was what the schedule said. My eyes swept the line. The men ahead of me were focused. No one looked nervous. But something in the air was off. It wasn't sound. It was the way people moved, just a fraction too slow, like they were waiting for something they couldn't name. I shifted my weight, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The shadows along the fence twitched. A faint click echoed from the direction of the observation tower. Ethan was somewhere out there. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the weight of his presence the way a soldier feels the presence of a scope on the back of their neck. It was an old instinct. I raised my weapon, scanned the tree line, and saw it. A red dot. A clean circle of light sitting right over my heart. I froze. Laser sights during these drills were supposed to be green. Red meant something entirely different. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had grabbed the wrong gear. But the dot didn't waver. It was steady, controlled, deliberate. My mouth went dry. My hand twitched toward my radio, but before I could speak, the night split open. The shot was not loud. It was precise. It hit me with the kind of force that bends reality in half. The impact slammed through my chest like being struck by a hammer. The ground tilted sideways and I stumbled backward, boots sliding in the mud. For an instant I saw the stars above the base, cold and distant. Then the pain came like a flood. It wasn't sharp. It was crushing. My lungs locked. Air became something I had to fight for. My body hit the ground hard, gravel scraping against my hands. I heard someone yell, "Accidental discharge." It was Ethan's voice, clear and commanding. Not panicked. Controlled. As if he had been waiting for this line all night. Footsteps thundered around me. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Orders snapped through the radios. Secure the perimeter. Check the line. Medic up. Everything moved in fast, clean rhythm, too smooth for chaos. This wasn't panic. This was containment. My fingers clawed at the earth as warmth spread beneath my ribs. The laser dot was gone, but the hole it left behind burned. Someone kneeled beside me, hands pressing down on my chest. The world narrowed to their breath against my ear. The metallic tang of blood in the air, the faraway sound of the tower siren. My vision blurred at the edges, floodlights fractured into pale halos. Through the noise, I picked out Ethan's voice again. Calm, directing people like he was saving me instead of being the reason I was on the ground. Keep the area clear. She's losing blood. Accidental discharge. We'll need a full statement. He didn't sound like a brother. He sounded like a man closing a file. The weight on my chest grew heavier. The sound of radios turned into static. Someone kept telling me to stay with them. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. My heartbeat slowed into long, uneven thuds. The stars above Fort Liberty looked like holes punched in black paper. Cold air scraped my throat. Someone slid a stretcher beside me. I felt hands lift me, but the world didn't move the way it should. It felt distant, like watching everything from underwater. Faces bent over me. Some looked frightened. Others didn't look at me at all. They were looking at Ethan, waiting for instructions. He nodded once, and people obeyed. That was the moment I understood just how deep his reach went. On paper, he was just an observer, but no one questioned him. No one asked why he was standing over me instead of letting the medics lead. The stretcher jolted as they lifted me. The night sky spun. Sirens started somewhere beyond the fence, the kind of sound that should mean help was coming. But it only made the air feel colder. The pain in my chest was sharp now, radiating out in hot waves that blurred everything else. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Slow, uncertain, fading. Someone pushed a mask over my mouth. Oxygen filled my lungs in short bursts. I tried to speak to say Ethan's name, but the words dissolved into the mask. No one heard me. Or maybe they didn't want to. The edges of my vision pulled inward like a curtain. I focused on the floodlights because they were the only steady thing left. Ethan's silhouette stood just outside their glow hands on his hips, head tilted down. He looked like a man watching a job get done. For a second, our eyes met. His expression didn't change. It wasn't victory or regret. It was calculation. As the world dimmed, I thought of the house in Fayetteville, of the way our father's boots sounded when he crossed the porch, of how Ethan learned to control a room without raising his voice. That same silence wrapped around me now, thick and inescapable. The sirens grew louder. The stretcher moved. My heartbeat faltered. Then it slipped. I fell through the sound, through the light, through everything. There was no sky anymore, just a weightless darkness pressing against my skin. And in that last breath before it all went black, the thought was sharp and clear. He had planned this. He had made it look clean. He had taken everything from me without lifting his voice. The night swallowed the rest. The first thing I remembered was the sound, a slow beeping, steady and stubborn, pulling me up from somewhere dark and cold. Then came the light too bright, cutting across my eyelids. My throat ached like it had been clawed raw. When I tried to breathe, pain rippled through my chest in tight waves. I opened my eyes to a ceiling that wasn't familiar, washed in pale hospital light. For a long moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I saw the uniformed nurse adjusting an IV line beside me, and it clicked like a round sliding into a chamber. Womack Army Medical Center, the heart of the base, the place soldiers came back to when the world tried to erase them. I couldn't move at first. My body felt too heavy, like I was tied down beneath the sheets. There was a bandage strapped across my chest and wires climbing over my skin. My mouth was dry, my voice a whisper I didn't recognize. The nurse leaned over, told me not to speak yet, that I'd been through surgery. Her voice was steady, the kind they teach in medical training, but her eyes flicked down to the monitor in a way that told me the story she wasn't allowed to say out loud. I had been close, too close. I didn't need to ask. I saw it in the way she moved. I heard it in the way my own heartbeat dragged in my ears. I had died, at least for a moment. Later, when the room cleared and only the quiet hum of machines remained, a doctor walked in. He was calm, practiced, carrying a clipboard and the kind of polite tone they use with people who aren't supposed to remember what happened. He explained everything in clipped sentences. Cardiac arrest for approximately 3 minutes. Emergency surgery to repair damage near the heart. Internal bleeding stabilized. Prognosis guarded but promising. I lay there listening, feeling each word settle like dust on the floor. I'd spent years overseas watching soldiers come through hospitals like this. I'd seen the lines on their faces when they realized how close they'd come to disappearing. Now, I understood that look from the inside. When the doctor left, I turned my head toward the small table beside the bed. My dog tags were there, placed neatly in a plastic tray as if to remind me who I was supposed to be. Across the room hung a clipboard with a clean printed label, "Training Accident." That was the official story. Just 2 words. Simple. Easy to file away. No names, no intent, no weight. If you looked at that clipboard, you'd never know someone had aimed a weapon at my heart and pulled the trigger. You'd just think a soldier made a mistake. The door opened again. Ethan stepped in like he belonged there. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a base-issued sweatshirt and that same steady expression he always wore when he wanted to own a room without asking for permission. He smiled at me the way people smile at a camera. Not too wide. Controlled. Familiar. He said he was glad I made it. His voice was smooth, easy. If anyone had walked in at that moment, they would have thought he was a concerned brother. But beneath that smile, I saw the calculation. He pulled up a chair beside the bed and started talking about procedures reports, recovery time. I stared at him, not moving. He told me he'd already spoken with command, that with what had happened, I'd probably be offered a medical discharge. It's the cleanest way he said. Cleanest. Like I was something that needed to be removed without leaving a stain. My chest burned beneath the bandages, not from the wound, but from the way his words wrapped around the air in the room. He talked about how the Army would take care of everything quietly, how this didn't have to turn into anything bigger, how we could keep the family name clear. He said it with the same certainty he used when we were kids, and he told me I would always be a step behind him. I let him speak. I watched his mouth move, while the machine behind me kept count of a heartbeat that shouldn't still exist. When he finished, he leaned closer, like he wanted to make sure I understood. "Riley, this is the best option for you," he said softly. "Just let it go. Just let it go." The same phrase he used when we were young and I caught him lying to our father. The same phrase he used when he stole credit for something I had done. He always wanted me quiet, obedient, disposable. That word "training accident" on the clipboard was his shield, and he wanted me to stay under it with him. If I stayed silent, it would be over. They would remove my name from the rosters, pack my things, fold my uniform, hand me a medical file with a nice clean line. The world would move on, and Ethan would keep everything. But lying there with tubes in my veins and the weight of what almost happened pressing against my ribs, something shifted. I wasn't the quiet girl from Fayetteville anymore. I had survived more than this overseas. I had survived men with real weapons who didn't have my blood in their veins. Ethan didn't scare me. What scared me was how easily the system could erase me if I let it. When he left the room, the door closing with that soft hospital click, I stared at the white ceiling and felt the shape of resolve settle into place. If I stayed quiet, I would disappear. If I spoke, I might burn everything down. Either way, the version of me that used to obey him was already gone. I turned my head toward the clipboard again. Training accident. 2 words. I whispered them under my breath, not as surrender, but as a promise. They thought they were writing the ending. They were wrong. It was only the beginning. The night I decided to fight back, the hospital room was silent except for the steady rhythm of the monitors. I waited until the nurse finished her rounds and the hallway lights dimmed to their soft after-hours glow. My body still ached from the surgery, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Pain has a way of sanding everything down until only what matters remains. I pulled the thin hospital blanket aside, slowly sat up, and reached for the small black notebook that one of my old team sergeants had sent with the Get Well flowers. It wasn't really a notebook. It was a contact list. I had built it over the years during deployments and rotations. It contained people who had seen things, people who understood how the Army really works when no one is watching. I didn't call anyone that night. I just stared at the names and thought about the pattern that had always followed Ethan. Smooth promotions, invisible favors, accidents that were never accidents. The next morning, I requested access to my case file under the pretense of wanting to review it before signing any medical discharge paperwork. The clerk was polite, efficient, and unaware of the storm sitting under my calm face. It didn't take long to confirm what I already suspected. The official report was barely 2 pages. A single line summarized the entire event: accidental discharge during night training. No mention of why Ethan was there. No mention of the red laser sight. No mention of anything that mattered. It was clean. Too clean. I had seen enough fabricated reports in war zones to recognize one when I read it. Ethan had crafted a perfect ghost story, one that left no fingerprints. But ghosts leave shadows. I started pulling threads quietly. I reached out to an old squad mate, Marcus Hale, who now worked logistics at another base in Texas. He owed me a favor from an ugly convoy run years ago. He dug into internal records where my name couldn't be tied back to the search. A few days later, a message arrived through a secure channel. Ethan's name was connected to 2 prior training incidents, both labeled accidents, both involving soldiers who had been removed from active duty afterward. One of them had suffered a serious injury during a night exercise not unlike mine. The other had simply vanished from records, transferred out, and never heard from again. On paper, none of it proved anything. In reality, it was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Ethan had done this before. I spent long nights sitting upright in my hospital bed reading every policy document I could access through the Army's internal network: whistleblower protocols, criminal investigation procedures, JAG channels, CID reporting chains. For the first time, I wasn't looking at those documents as a soldier obeying the system. I was studying the system itself, learning where the cracks lived, where leverage hid. If I went after Ethan publicly, he would crush me with rank and charm before I even finished speaking. But the system that protected him also had pressure points. The law doesn't care about family names, it cares about evidence. So I built my plan like I had built field ops overseas: quiet, layered, step by step. I began recording every conversation with medical staff, every follow-up meeting with command, every casual check-in from Ethan. He visited often, pretending to care, trying to make sure the narrative held. He underestimated me. He thought the quiet little sister would stay that way. I mirrored his smile, nodded in all the right places, and pressed record each time his voice filled the room. The real power wasn't in yelling. It was in watching him talk, calm and confident, not realizing he was giving me rope. My next call was to Lieutenant Grace Turner, a former intelligence officer I had served with overseas. She had once exposed a procurement scandal and knew the whistleblower process inside and out. When she picked up the phone, her voice carried the same dry humor it always had. She listened as I told her what happened, not interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You'll have to be smarter than him." Not louder, smarter. She walked me through everything step by step. How to document, how to build a timeline, how to keep my name off the radar until the pieces were too solid to ignore. The next day, I requested copies of the original range schedule under the pretense of reviewing training timelines for my discharge evaluation. The paperwork showed exactly what I expected. Ethan's name had been added manually, no author listed, no digital signature. Another quiet favor from someone in his pocket. I added it to the growing folder in my lap. Each page was small, maybe meaningless on its own, but together they started to sound like the truth. I realized something else too. Ethan wasn't scared. He was certain. And certainty makes people sloppy. The more time passed, the more I saw the edges of his plan. He wanted me out, clean, silent, forgotten. He was already acting like it was done. That arrogance would be his first mistake. My second breakthrough came from a man named Ruiz, a communications tech who had served with me overseas and now worked at a stateside unit. He traced the Armory's sign-out records for that night. There it was. A red laser sight checked out under a generic observer line. Not part of our training loadout. The ID number matched equipment Ethan had access to through his unit. No one had bothered to cover that trail because no one thought they'd need to. I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest, the same feeling I used to get before raids overseas. The difference between fear and focus is a line you learn to walk when everything's on the line. I had crossed it before. I could cross it again. Ethan thought I would stay small, that I'd fold into the silence like I always had. He didn't understand that silence can cut both ways. I wasn't going to make noise. I was going to build a blade out of every page, every file, every whisper. And when it was sharp enough, I would let the system itself draw blood. I closed my laptop late that night and stared at the reflection in the dark window. For the first time since the bullet ripped through me, I didn't see a victim. I saw someone standing up from a cage she'd once mistaken for home. If Ethan wanted me gone quietly, he was about to learn what quiet really sounds like when it turns against you. Driving back to Fayetteville felt like driving through the bones of a past I thought I had buried. The same cracked roads, the same oak trees bending over the asphalt, the same weight pressing against my chest the closer I got to the house I had tried to escape my entire adult life. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but just as rigid. Fresh coat of paint, same flag hanging on the porch, same porch light that used to burn into my bedroom window at night. I parked at the curb and sat in the car for a moment, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. I had faced war zones with less hesitation than I felt walking up those wooden steps. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. The house smelled like floor polish, old wood, and something colder discipline that had never left. My father was in the living room, sitting in his old chair like a piece of furniture carved into the house itself. His posture was straight hands resting on the arms of the chair, eyes sharp in that way that always made me feel like I was being inspected, not seen. He didn't get up. He didn't need to. That was his way of making people small. "You're walking?" he said flatly, as if surviving a bullet wasn't worth a full sentence. I nodded once, stepping farther inside, letting the door close behind me. "Yeah," I said. "I'm walking." His gaze flicked down to the faint scar visible through the collar of my shirt, then back up to my face. "Ethan told me it was an accident," he said. His voice was low, calm, the same voice he used to explain how discipline made good soldiers. "A mistake. These things happen." I let the words settle in the air for a moment. That phrase, "these things happen," was one I had heard all my life. It was what he said when Ethan broke a window and I got blamed. It was what he said when Ethan lied and I stayed silent. It was his way of rewriting reality until it suited him. "Where is he?" I asked. My father didn't answer. A door opened in the hallway and Ethan appeared like he had been waiting for his cue. Civilian clothes, that easy smile, hands in his pockets like he was walking into a family dinner, not the aftermath of an attempted erasure. "Little sister," he said softly, "you should be resting." The way he said it made my teeth clench. My father leaned back slightly, as if this was all a simple conversation, a misunderstanding that could be smoothed out by the right words. "He's family," my father said. "We handle family matters quietly." I turned my head slowly to look at him. "Like you handled everything else I said." His jaw tightened. That was the first crack. Ethan moved closer, hands still in his pockets, the kind of movement that pretended to be harmless but never was. "I know you're upset," he said, "but this doesn't have to get ugly. We can keep this contained. No one needs to get hurt." I let out a breath that sounded too much like a laugh. "You already hurt me," I said. "You pulled the trigger." His expression didn't change. It didn't have to. Ethan had always been good at holding a straight face while twisting the knife. "It was a clean solution," he said after a long pause. "You were becoming a problem. The family's name matters. You know that." My father didn't flinch. He didn't stop him. He didn't even look surprised. He just sat there like a man listening to a weather report. I stared at Ethan, at the brother who had smiled through every betrayal since childhood. "Say it again," I said. He tilted his head. "What? Say it." I repeated. "Say what you just said." His mouth curved into something close to pity. "You were a problem," he said slowly. "I fixed it." The words landed in the room like the crack of a rifle. There was no anger in his voice, no guilt, just certainty. My father finally spoke, but not to him, to me. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. "We don't tear each other down. We protect the family." I turned to him, and for the first time in my life I didn't see a father. I saw a man who had raised Ethan to believe his cruelty was noble. "You didn't protect me," I said. "You protected your reflection. And I'm not it." Something in his eyes flickered. Not regret, not shame, just the briefest recognition that he no longer had a daughter willing to bend. Ethan took another step forward. "It's over, Riley," he said. "Just take the discharge. Walk away. Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be." I looked at him and felt the strange calm that used to come to me in the middle of firefights overseas. The world gets small in those moments, clear and sharp. "No," I said. "This isn't over. Not for me." For the first time, Ethan's smile faltered. Barely, but it was there. A tremor at the edges of his perfect control. I stepped closer to him, close enough to smell the faint trace of his cologne, the same one he used to wear at family events. "You want to keep the family name clean," I said quietly. "But you forgot something. I've worn it too. I've bled for it. And I'm not going to disappear so you can polish your reputation." My father's voice hardened. "Watch your tone." I turned my eyes back to him, and this time I didn't look away. "I've watched my tone my entire life," I said, "and look where it got me." Silence stretched across the room. The same silence that used to make me shrink now felt different. It felt like air I could breathe. Ethan straightened, regaining that practiced ease. "You think anyone will believe you?" he asked. "You think the system isn't already on my side? I've built this for years. You have nothing." I smiled then. Not a warm smile, a sharp one. "You're wrong," I said. "I have everything you've given me, every word, every signature, every second of your arrogance." He blinked just once, and in that blink I saw it. The faintest shadow of doubt. That was enough for now. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to throw anything. I didn't need him to break. I just needed him to know I wasn't the girl in this house anymore. "Good," I said quietly. "Now I know exactly who I'm dealing with." I walked toward the door without looking back. For years this house had been a cage, but that night it became something else. A place where the mask finally cracked. Ethan thought control was permanent. He thought silence was loyalty. He was wrong. The air outside was cold, sharper than it had been when I arrived. I breathed it in like oxygen after years underwater. Behind me, the house stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm finally breaks. The plan began in silence. No shouting, no chaos. Just careful lines drawn in the dark where Ethan couldn't see them. I knew that going after him publicly would only make him stronger. Men like Ethan thrived in the spotlight, but in the quiet corridors of the system, under the weight of paperwork recordings and protocol, arrogance became a liability. I contacted the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division first. Not through a hotline, not through a formal complaint. I reached out directly to an investigator I trusted, Special Agent Daniel Cole, a man I had served beside during an investigation overseas years ago. He had seen the way command structures could shield men like Ethan, and he had a reputation for refusing to let that stand. When we met, it wasn't in an office. It was in the corner booth of a small diner off Bragg Boulevard, a place too ordinary to draw attention. Cole arrived in civilian clothes, but his posture carried the unmistakable precision of a man trained to see through lies. He didn't offer small talk. He listened as I laid out everything I had collected: training schedules, armory records, Ethan's visits to my hospital room, the fact that he had been present at other accidents. When I finished, he folded his hands together and said one word: clean. He wasn't complimenting me. He was describing Ethan's operation. Then he leaned closer. But nobody's perfect. That was the moment the air shifted. It wasn't just my fight anymore. Cole opened a formal CID investigation without my name attached to the front page. He would build a separate evidentiary chain, hidden under procedural layers designed to keep Ethan blind until it was too late to maneuver out of it. He asked if I was ready to be bait. I said yes without blinking. That night, he arranged for me to meet Captain Leona Price, a legal officer with the United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. She was known for being meticulous, the kind of person who could find a crack in legal armor no one else saw. We met in a quiet JAG office near the airfield. She was small, precise eyes like polished glass. She listened to Cole lay out the case, then looked at me and said, "If we do this, we do it right. No loose ends, no emotional shortcuts. You need to understand what happens if this goes wrong." I did. If the recording wasn't airtight, if a single piece of evidence was obtained out of bounds, Ethan could turn it against me. He could make me the problem. He'd done it before. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "Then we're going to trap him in his own language," she said. Over the next week, CID and JAG built the net. I watched it unfold like a quiet operation overseas, except this time, the battlefield wasn't sand or jungle. It was the Army's own bureaucracy. Cole requested authorization for recording under Article 31 procedures. Price drew up the documentation to ensure admissibility in court. Every cable, every mic, every angle would be legal, clean, and impossible to dismiss. The question was how to make Ethan talk. Cole had a simple answer: give him what he thought he wanted most control. An upcoming internal recognition event at Fort Liberty provided the perfect stage. It was a small gathering of officers and NCOs. No cameras, no press, just the kind of environment Ethan felt most untouchable in. I arranged for an invitation to be extended to him under the guise of mending fences, of keeping the family name intact. He took the bait without hesitation. Men like Ethan never turned down a chance to play the hero. On the day of the event, CID arrived hours earlier, disguised as support staff. They swept the room, planted high-grade recording devices in the lighting rig, embedded 2 additional directional mics near the podium, and rigged a small camera behind the ceremonial flags. Every piece was logged and documented by Price. There would be no legal loophole. My role was simple, but brutal. I had to walk into that room and give him just enough rope to hang himself. When I looked in the mirror that night before leaving the barracks, I barely recognized myself. Dress uniform, sharp scar, faint but visible above the collar face set in quiet steel. I wasn't walking in as the little sister anymore. I was walking in as a soldier who had bled for this ground and wasn't going to vanish under his story. Cole gave me a nod as I entered the hall. Price sat near the back, blending in with the crowd, her expression calm but alert. I walked to the center of the room, the soft hum of conversation wrapping around me like a net. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later. He wore his uniform like a costume. Polished boots, perfect ribbons, easy smile. He scanned the room, saw me, and that smile widened. He thought this was his stage. He thought I was stepping back into his orbit. He walked up to me like nothing had ever happened, hands loosely clasped behind his back. "You look good," he said softly. "Stronger." I held his gaze. "You should know something about strength," I said. "You spent your life trying to take it from me." He laughed under his breath, that same low, condescending laugh he had used since we were kids. "Riley," he said, "you don't have to keep pretending this was anything but a mistake." His words were almost casual. Almost. But the microphones didn't care about tone. They cared about sound. Every syllable etched itself into record. Cole stood by the side door pretending to check a clipboard, but I could feel his eyes on us. Ethan leaned closer, his voice dropping into the soft threat he reserved for private moments. "You know why I did it," he whispered. "You've always been the weak link. You almost ruined everything Dad built. Someone had to make a choice. I made it clean. It's better this way. No trial, no stain." I didn't move. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The recording caught everything clean and sharp. "It wasn't clean," I said softly. "It was cowardice." His jaw twitched. He wasn't used to me talking to him like this. He straightened, searching for control. "It's already over," he said. "The report's written. You can scream all you want, Riley, but no one will ever believe you." I tilted my head, letting my voice drop to a whisper only the mics could love. "You just told them everything they need to believe me." For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Not fear. Realization. The kind of realization that comes too late. I stepped back. Cole gave the smallest nod. The room shifted as if the air itself had drawn a line between us. Price stood up slowly, not rushing, her presence suddenly undeniable. Two CID agents in plain clothes moved closer, blending into the crowd like shadows. Ethan noticed too late. His voice rose sharp now, losing its polished edge. "What did you do?" he hissed. "What did you—" He didn't finish. Cole stepped forward, badge flashing just enough for him to see it. Price followed, document folder in hand. Everything had been planned down to the breath. Sergeant Ethan Von Cole said calmly, voice cutting through the noise like a blade you might want to stop talking. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was surgical. Ethan's control, the thing he built his life on, cracked like glass under weight it wasn't designed to bear. He glanced around the room, searching for allies. He found none. The officers he had charmed for years avoided his eyes. I stood still, breathing steadily, the scar on my chest throbbing like a memory that had finally found its purpose. Cole didn't arrest him that night. That would come later, after the evidence was processed, after the JAG had tied every legal knot tight. But that night was the moment the net closed. That night was the first time Ethan realized the silence he had always owned didn't belong to him anymore. I walked out of the hall without looking back. Behind me, the system he thought he controlled was already moving. Slow, cold, inescapable. The night of the ceremony came wrapped in the kind of cold, controlled air that only military halls seem to hold. The banners were hung with perfect symmetry. The polished floor gleamed under the harsh white lights, and the smell of starched uniforms filled the space like something sterile and heavy. Every chair was aligned, every flag at exact regulation height. It was a night meant to honor Ethan Vaughn, a night he believed was his victory lap. He walked into that hall as if it belonged to him, chin high, dress uniform, flawless ribbons catching the light. Applause broke out as he took his place near the stage, and he wore the applause like a crown. For years he had built this moment layer by layer, lie by lie. I watched from the back of the room, dressed in my own uniform boots, polished to mirror black. The weight of the scar under my collar felt sharper that night. It wasn't pain. It was clarity. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was the consequence he never saw coming. The lights dimmed slightly, and the commander stepped to the podium, clearing his throat into the microphone. He spoke about Ethan's service record, his leadership, his dedication to the unit. People nodded. They believed the story because Ethan had spent years perfecting it. Every word was polished, rehearsed, easy to swallow. But buried inside this perfect night was the crack he never saw. Because this time he didn't control the narrative. I felt the shift before anyone else did. A CID agent in dress uniform slipped quietly along the side wall, giving a small nod to the AV technician. Another signal came from the back, where Captain Leona Price sat with a sealed folder on her lap. The commander finished his speech and turned toward Ethan with a smile. The lights narrowed into a bright cone on the stage. Ethan stepped forward to accept the award, that signature smile etched onto his face. But before his hand could touch the plaque, the sound system clicked softly, interrupting the feed. A new audio file began to play. It wasn't music. It wasn't a speech. It was Ethan's own voice. The same voice I had heard through the crack in the briefing room door. Calm, measured, familiar. Make it look like a training accident. The words hung in the air like a blade. The crowd froze. No one breathed. The commander's stiffened hand hovering over the award. Ethan's smile faltered just for a second, but in a room that silent, it felt like thunder. Another line followed. You know how these things go. Training accidents happen all the time. Every syllable echoed across the hall. His tone wasn't one of panic or defense. It was pure cold control. The sound didn't need any context. It told its own story. A story he thought no one would ever hear. My heartbeat slowed as the lights shifted again. No one was clapping now. No one moved. It was the kind of silence that slices clean through polished reputations. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, hunting for a way out. He found none. The recording continued for another 20 seconds. 20 seconds that changed everything. When the final word faded, the hall remained frozen. The commander looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. A few soldiers shifted in their seats, their faces stiff, their trust unraveling in real time. Ethan opened his mouth trying to speak, but the weight of his own voice crushed whatever explanation he thought he could offer. He looked toward the back of the room. Our eyes met across the hall. He saw me standing there in full uniform, spine-straight hands behind my back. Not hidden, not broken, present, whole. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood that he was no longer the one holding the strings. CID agents moved in with the quiet precision of men who had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Two approached from the sides, their presence steady but undeniable. Cole led them, his badge flashing under the lights. "Sergeant Ethan Vaughn," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the microphone like a clean cut. "You are under investigation by the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division." Murmurs rippled through the room like a wave, sharp and rising. Ethan took a step back, the smile gone, now replaced by something raw and twisted, shock and disbelief wrapped in a single breath. "This is a mistake," he said, but his voice cracked at the edges. He glanced at the commander as if expecting help. None came. The commander's jaw was tight, his posture rigid, the plaque still in his hand, but no longer meant for Ethan. Cole signaled to his team. The sound of handcuffs closing around Ethan's wrists sliced through the room with perfect clarity. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. That metallic click said everything. This was the end of the story he had written for himself. Soldiers who had once laughed at his jokes now stared in silence. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others didn't move at all. They were watching a man fall from a height he believed untouchable. CID agents led him down the aisle, and as he passed me, he tried to hold my gaze like he always had when we were kids, that silent command to look away. This time, I didn't. I held it. I didn't say a word. He needed to see that he no longer had a hold on me. The hall remained silent long after the doors closed behind him. That silence was not the one I grew up under. This one belonged to me. It was the silence of truth cutting through years of control. Price stepped forward quietly, handing over the official documents that would put the rest of the machine into motion. Ethan wasn't just being accused. He was being legally cornered. Every recording, every document, every quiet move over the past weeks had led to this single moment. I stepped toward the stage, my boots echoing against the floor, and turned to face the room. Not because I needed to make a speech, not because I wanted applause, but because I wanted every single person who had once turned a blind eye to see me standing there alive when I was never supposed to be. My voice didn't shake when I finally spoke. "If you ever thought you didn't have a voice," I said slowly, letting each word cut through the air, "look at what just happened." No one answered. They didn't have to. They had seen it. The man they thought untouchable had been taken down, not with fury, but with truth. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. Somewhere outside, the night wind moved against the flagpoles. Inside, the world Ethan had built was cracking apart, and for the first time, the weight pressing on my chest wasn't fear. It was freedom. It didn't come with fireworks or cheers. It came with a pair of handcuffs and a room too quiet to ignore. The kind of quiet where justice breathes. If you ever thought you didn't have a voice, look at this moment. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, the Army shifted into a kind of cold precision I had only ever witnessed overseas during high-level investigations. Ethan was no longer Sergeant Vaughn Goldenboy of Fort Liberty. He was detainee Vaughn under formal charge for attempted premeditated murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. His arrest wasn't just a headline inside the base. It was a tremor that moved through every hallway, every office, every quiet corner where people once whispered his name with respect. His perfect file was opened, peeled apart, dissected piece by piece. Everything he had built so carefully was now evidence. CID released the official report to command. The recording, the witness statements, the range logs, the manipulation of training schedules, the hospital visits, all of it formed a chain that was impossible to break. Ethan's attorneys tried to spin the story, calling it a misunderstanding, a procedural failure, a training mishap. But recordings don't blink. The law doesn't care about charm. When the Article 32 hearing began, he sat in a crisp uniform that no longer fit him the way it once did. He wasn't leading anymore. He was answering. His eyes searched the room for someone to save him. There was no one left. The family name that had shielded him for so long had turned into a mirror reflecting everything he had tried to bury. My father was called in for questioning within the first week. His role in protecting Ethan over the years, his silence about the previous accidents, and the influence he had used inside the chain of command to keep reports buried were suddenly part of an official CID file. He wasn't charged at first, but the investigation opened a door he couldn't close. The man who had spent his entire life standing tall in uniform was now sitting across from investigators being asked about the son he had protected and the daughter he had tried to silence. The house in Fayetteville stayed quiet during those weeks. I didn't go back. I didn't need to. That silence was no longer my burden. It belonged to him now. Ethan's trial moved forward faster than I expected. When the charges were read aloud, attempted murder, falsifying official reports, abuse of authority, the air in the courtroom felt heavy enough to choke on. I didn't testify in anger. I testified in detail. I answered every question. I didn't look at him when I described the red laser on my chest, the shot, the sound of his voice declaring it a training accident. I didn't look when they played the recording again in front of the military panel. I didn't need to. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It was theirs to hear and his to drown in. His conviction came down like a clean hammer. Years in military prison. Dishonorable discharge. Every title, every ribbon, every inch of respect stripped from him like dust wiped off a forgotten shelf. The day they led him out in shackles, he tried to find my eyes again like he always had. I didn't give him that gift. He didn't deserve it. My father didn't attend the hearing. Rumor on base said he'd been placed on administrative review. For a man like him, that was almost worse than being charged. His silence was no longer loyalty. It was evidence. I didn't celebrate the verdict. There was no victory in it. It wasn't about winning. It was about breathing without a weight crushing my chest. A few days later, I was called into the commander's office. The atmosphere was different now. They stood when I entered, not out of pity, out of respect. The review board had cleared my record. The official cause of injury had been amended. It no longer read training accident. It read attempted homicide. My rank and honors were fully restored. They offered me a promotion. They offered me a chance to stay. I declined, not because I hated the Army, but because the uniform no longer represented the same thing it once did. I had spent my life fighting wars outside and inside these walls. I didn't want my next breath to belong to this institution. I wanted it to belong to me. Signing my discharge papers wasn't a surrender. It was the first choice I'd made for myself in years. The day I walked out of Fort Liberty for the last time, the air smelled like pine and rain. The same air that had once carried the weight of his control now felt clean. I looked back only once. The gates that had once felt like the edge of a cage now looked like a line I had finally crossed. Ethan was behind bars. My father was under investigation. The family legacy they had built on silence and control was cracking, and I was walking away not as a victim, but as someone who had forced the truth into the light and lived to see it burn through the lies. It didn't end with a fight. It didn't end with a gun. It ended with the law. Clean, precise, unforgiving. The kind of ending that leaves no room for him to crawl back. And that was enough. I moved to the Outer Banks at the edge of spring when the ocean still carried the bite of winter, but the air had started to soften. The house I found was small, a weathered structure with salt-stained windows and a porch that faced the sea. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. It was quiet. No bass, no salutes, no footsteps echoing down sterile military hallways, just the rhythm of the waves and a kind of silence that didn't suffocate. The first few weeks I woke before dawn without meaning to. My body still followed the discipline that had been drilled into me since I was a teenager. But instead of reporting to formation, I walked down to the water barefoot and let the tide pull at the sand beneath my feet. For the first time in years, no one was watching me. No one was waiting to control the narrative of my existence. I had thought the end would feel like victory, like standing over a battlefield with the enemy finally crushed. But it didn't. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. I spent hours in that house letting my body heal from what had been done to it, and my mind from what had been demanded of it. Sometimes the wound in my chest ached when the wind blew cold. It was a reminder not of weakness but of survival. A reminder that I had died for 3 minutes, and then decided to come back as someone new. I didn't build walls around this new life. I built doors. One of those doors opened when I walked into a small community center for veterans near the docks. A group met there every week, men and women who had carried different wars on their shoulders, but shared the same silence afterward. Some bore scars you could see. Others carried the kind you couldn't. I sat in the back the first night listening. They talked about nightmares, about fractured trust, about what it meant to build a life after being broken by people you once trusted completely. Their stories weren't identical to mine, but their eyes carried the same weight. I started showing up every week after that. At first I didn't speak. Then one night I did. I told them about the night at Fort Liberty, about the red laser on my chest, about the way silence almost killed me, about how I used that same silence to bring him down. No one interrupted. No one pitied me. They just listened. When I finished, someone at the back whispered, "That's how we take our lives back." A few months later, I began working with an organization that supported victims of abuse inside the military. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't trying to be. But I understood the way control works, the way it creeps into corners and convinces people they're alone. I understood how powerful it is to hear someone say I lived. I fought back. You can too. My name started appearing in places I never expected. Advocacy lists, closed-door discussions, policy circles. I didn't go there to make speeches. I went to stand in quiet rooms and remind decision-makers what their silence can cost someone. I was not a headline. I was proof. On the anniversary of the shooting, I returned to Fayetteville. Not to the house. I drove past it, windows rolled down, letting the wind wash through. The porch light was off. The flag was gone. The house wasn't a cage anymore. It was just wood and paint and ghosts that no longer owned me. I kept driving. I reached Fort Liberty's perimeter fence, parked my truck, and stood outside the gate. I didn't step through. I didn't need to. The place where my story had nearly ended wasn't where it defined me anymore. I whispered to the dark, not for anyone else to hear. They called it a training accident, but it was the beginning of the truth. The wind carried the words away, and for once, I didn't need them to come back. That night back at the shore, I sat on the porch with the sound of the ocean pressing against the silence. No uniforms, no orders, no one else writing my story. Just me. And that was enough. I had lived through a bullet meant to erase me, through a family that tried to shape me into their shadow, through a system that nearly let them. And now every wave breaking on the sand sounded like a heartbeat that belonged entirely to me. They said it was a training accident. I called it the moment I was reborn.